here at the Accelerator Center. Today, I'm happy to bring you a panel of experts who will be discussing all things threat modeling. We'll be joined today by Martin, John, and Mark, moderated by Bill over at Foxnet. First of all, just wanted to give a big thank you to Foxnet for sponsoring today's event and making it possible. So without further ado, I'm going to bring our panelists to the virtual stage. Over to you, Bill. We'll start with a couple of introductions to the panelists.
Okay. I'm Bill Fox. Thanks, Brandy. Bill Fox, CEO of Foxnet. We're a managed service provider here in Waterloo. We do everything IT, security, networking, monitoring of servers, backup, disaster recovery, and have partnered with eCentire in the past to provide their security services. And to that, I will introduce Marty.
Hello, my name is Marty Paris. I'm the CTO with Foxnet. My focus realistically inside the company is to align strategic alignment of any of the technologies that we use to bring it to the clients and help them understand how to apply that strategy to ensure their business goals and initiatives are achieved.
Mark?
Hi, I'm Mark Singster. I'm the author of No Safe Harbor, and I'm also eCentire's VP of Industry Security Strategies. eCentire is a managed detection and response provider, which means on a 24/7 basis, we are monitoring our clients' environments. We're looking for suspicious activity, and when we find it, we investigate in near real time, and our mission is to contain or disrupt those events before they disrupt your business.
Okay, and John?
Hi, I'm John Svazik. I'm the founder and principal consultant at EliteSec. EliteSec is essentially a boutique cybersecurity consultancy aiming to help the scale-ups and startups in the region to increase their cybersecurity resiliency and basically provide pragmatic advice with candid discussion.
All right, very well. So we've prepared a bunch of questions, and I think at the end we're going to have a question and answer period. And I'll be directing some of these questions to John, Mark, and Marty, and in some cases, the panel entirely. So I'm going to start off with you, John. What is threat modeling and why is it important?
So threat modeling is an exercise that's normally done to identify threats, is probably the easiest way to put it. So generally it doesn't matter if you're creating a piece of software or if you are taking a look at your day-to-day business model. Every organization faces threats in one way or another. I have a friend of mine who loves to talk about threats in terms of driving to the office every day. Obviously, we're in a pandemic. We're facing different types of threats. So what threat modeling is itself is identifying what those threats are, what are the potential vectors, and then what are the potential solutions that we can come up. How can we mitigate those threats? Can we prevent them from happening? If they happen, can we contain the damage that's done? And it's essentially an exercise in going through that to figure out what we can do to solve for threats and better protect ourselves, our organizations, our customers as well.
All righty. Mark, I'm going to direct this one to you. Why are criminals targeting vendors at the DevOps level?
Yeah, there's kind of three reasons that they're doing this. And we saw this with SolarWinds, for example, where in that attack, they actually were, injecting malicious code into the source code of their products, and then actually doing things like eliminating logs, dev logs, and so on, to kind of obfuscate or hide the fact that they were buried within their legitimate systems. And the reason we do this is when you think about these types of providers, they're just like a utility, right? Companies have to use your technology to complete their business, which means they can't ignore the risk or they can't evade it. This isn't parachuting, where they say that's too dangerous for me. The reality is they have to use your tool, whether that's a healthcare record management system, accessing their clients, managing partners, whatever it might be that they have to do. It also means, too, that they can hide what they're doing and they reduce the risk that the investment in developing that malicious code, sometimes we'll call it a 0 day, like it's never been seen before, or an end day, which means it's relatively new. there's only one chance, there's only one company that can catch that they're up to badness. And so they're reducing that risk. They're increasing the likelihood that they're going to see a return. And ultimately, once they've infiltrated a vendor at source, they can use that trusted relationship with their client base to then go after all those targets downstream. So effectively, this is one of the most surefire economic models they have. Like I said, reduces their risk, increases their likelihood of revenue. That's profit by any person's definition. So we're going to see more and more of these types of attacks.
All right, very good. Thank you. Marty, why has security by design become an imperative?
Well, I think going back to what John was mentioning earlier, when you drive, you got to look at every day, and every day there's a possibility of some sort of intrusion against your network or your software or any part of your business environment. So really, you really have to kind of look at how do you align your business goals and controls, and how do you make sure that everything is covered off as you go through your design and your threat modeling. This includes alignment with a lot of new cybersecurity insurance policies, regulatory requirements. If you're trying to meet certain regulatory areas, you're going to be expected to meet certain threat models and ensure that you can show that you actually have controls around that. So, business now is starting to see this more as part of their core business values that they're going to have to drive forward. And it's going to be part of the things they're going to be measured on by their different providers, such as, clients right up to security and insurance models.
All right, thank you. Maybe I'll send this out to John and Mark. How do criminals go about identifying and compromising employees with access to DevOps? I'll start with you, John.
So a couple of ways. LinkedIn is probably one of the easiest ways that criminals are going to go target individual people. They're going to pick a target. They're going to definitely take a look at organizations that are more likely to pay. Seems to be the most common model. So once they have an organization in mind, they're going to start perusing through organizations' hierarchies by going to LinkedIn. And LinkedIn's fantastic for actually showing who works at an organization, what roles they have. Once they've picked a handful of people in the DevOps organization, then the real research begins. What sort of social media do these guys have? Are they reusing passwords? Is their usernames, emails, whatever else showing up in password leaks that are available online, both on the dark web and not so dark web? And potentially start poking around that way.
Yeah, John, I think you've nailed it here, right? And an important message in this is before they actually show up virtually in your environment. So if that's a phishing lure or however they're trying to source that access, they've already done their research and they are looking at industries that they feel are more susceptible. And that might be because of regulatory controls and compliance that they have to meet. It could be because of reputational damage and, they can't sustain that kind of impact to their business. And so they know they're more likely to pay. So they're engineering both individuals and businesses. And when they do this, and I think this is a second point to really make here, is not only have they started and done their homework before they arrive at the door, just per se, but they don't use self-evidently fake methodologies, right? They're not sending you lures that look like they're a streaming service that says your credit card's been rejected and, click this link to update your payment methodology. They know what your business looks like. They've stolen information, stolen documents, or bought them on the dark web as well. And they now know what drives you and what will likely get you to the outcome they're looking for, like surrendering your credentials as an example. So I'll give you two simple examples here. In one case, a criminal posed as a professional student, so think an engineer, from a legitimate, well-known school. So in this case, it wasn't, but say the University of Waterloo as an example. They look for a mentor, and this is a pretty common thing we see in the industry. And after establishing rapport and some back and forth for 2 to 3 weeks, they then sent a link that said, "Thanks so much. By the way, would you mind completing this survey so that I can get academic credit for our work?" And of course, that person is more than happy to do it. They see them as a trusted source. These are the kind of attacks that they're doing. And they can pivot that to go after lawyers or doctors or developers or CEOs, whatever you want, right? They can pick that sort of professional niche. And in other cases, they're using stolen information or socially engineered engineering searches. So they're looking at things like, what are the top searches that someone in development is going about doing? And maybe it's looking for new tools, or what credentials or accreditations should they have? What templates exist if I'm hiring people? How much should I pay them? So pay scale, salaries, those kind of things. And of course, they steal those legit docs, they weaponize them, and they set up, kind of chimera sites or sites that look like the legitimate source, but of course they're free. And you know what? Nothing is free in this world. So when you see the, per pay kind of service and you find the freemium version, it's just like your kids trying to find movies by avoiding Google Play or iTunes. Those things are likely malicious. They've got malvertising in them or whatever it might be. And they're doing the same kind of thing. And the point here to take away is they know how to target you. They know how to look like someone within your ecosystem. So it's a lot harder to distinguish between sort of nuisance types, legitimate traffic and unauthorized traffic that's looking to steal credentials.
Yes, we're certainly seeing a lot of that these days. Mark, here's another question for you. Beyond access to non-public data, what else can criminals do once they have access to applications at source?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on this, right? If they're able to inject their malware, their badness into your systems, they're effectively using you just like a parasite to then go and infect all those other hosts. So they can use you to access your client base. And we saw that most recently with Kaseya. Kaseya is a well-known and well-established leader in remote IT administration. And so they were able, again, they detected a vulnerability, or they found a vulnerability, they figured out how to exploit it. They then used that to get to thousands of clients using their tools. And unfortunately, again, it's another trusted relationship. You have an open gateway and they use that as their vector in. And just to give you an idea of how easy this is, they used a tool called Shodan.io, which is a publicly available tool, which is effectively the Google search for IT devices or internet connected devices. They could literally say, show me all public facing Kaseya servers. Now show me all public facing Kaseya servers that are running this version. And then that told them that's effectively their addressable market. That's exactly who they targeted. So they can use your trust relationship and your trust bond to effectively infiltrate any environment that they want that you're connected to.
Cool. I'm going to send this out to everybody. We'll start with you, Marty. How is the sensitivity of data determined?
Well, I think a lot of it's determined within your company. So there's certain regulatory requirements around, private data or personal data that you have to, take seriously and are driven with controls within your organization. However, just as both John and Mark have talked about, almost any data can be leveraged to potentially be used as a tool to actually hack into your system or to mislead people within your organization. So realistically, when you're looking at how important data is, you have to look at what is my private data, what is the data that I have to have proper controls around and ensure that they have controls and that they're measurable and that they're tested. And those are usually driven by some sort of regulatory or audit event that within your organization. So you have to mark that. However, you can't discount how important all your other data within your organization is, and really have some sort of model around that as well, because that again can be weaponized to basically use against you to get more information and potentially get at your private data.
All right, John?
Yeah, I agree with everything Martin was saying there. If you are following under some sort of regulation, be it Sarbanes-Oxley, be it HIPAA, be it PCI, whatever else, you generally have a framework in place that says this type of data is considered critical, this type of data is considered sensitive. Where things tend to get a little fuzzy is when you look at things that are not covered by those regulations. So, for example, usernames within your organization, email addresses, things like this, things that you may take for granted. If someone can figure out roughly what that format looks like, there's potential for abuse there. One thing that when it comes to classifying data, I often ask my own customers is kind of take a look at the data that you're all storing and then determine what you can't do without. So if you lost that bucket of data, say financials, if you lost all your financials, what would happen? Would the company come to a grinding halt? Probably yes. Okay, what about email addresses for a marketing campaign? Would that knock you out of business? And the answer is no. But when we're talking about marketing, we're talking about potential for GDPR or PIPEDA in Canada here for privacy regulation. Now, all of a sudden, that becomes a little more important. So you kind of have to take a look from two perspectives. One, how mission critical is it to the business? But then secondly, are there any regulations, any laws, any things in any regions that I'm working in to determine that sensitivity and how important that is? And in general, once you've identified, and we usually go with three buckets. We have highly sensitive mission critical data. We have sensitive data, maybe not mission critical, but it would definitely cause at least reputational harm if it was lost or manipulated or leaked. And then finally, public data, which is essentially, okay, that's fine. We expect this to be publicly available. There's no harm in that coming out. Once you've kind of bucketed these different things, now you can start focusing on, okay, what level of control do I want to put around those individual things, just to make sure that a worst case scenario doesn't happen.
All right. Did you have anything to add to that, Mark? Or?
Yeah, I just say I think Marty and John have sort of hit really well hit the first two buckets, right? Which is the regulated ones, and then the second one, of course, is, as John said, is sort of the non-regulated but mission critical, right? So what would happen to your business if X occurred to that data? I think the third one is any connections you have within your ecosystem, so both upstream and downstream within a supply chain. So do your clients, as an example, or your customers, do they have specific obligations? Because if they do, likely under a regulator, you actually are mandated. And if you're not, contractually, you probably are. And if you haven't been, then that client's not doing their job because they should have contractually obligated you to their compliance standards. And of course, going the other way, you're also kind of on the hook from a brand and reputation perspective for your suppliers. So what happens if somebody farther upstream does something that then has an impact on you? And this is where, of course, with, as John said, and Marty mentioned, as you look at PIPEDA and GDPR and, the 40 something states in the US that have privacy or data breach legislation, that landscape gets really complex and it's constantly changing. So you really do have to, I think it's best to take a pull kind of mentality. What happens to our business or our clients if this were to occur, and then work backwards to what you need to protect?
All right. Mark, maybe I'll come back to you. What type of encryption is used and how are encryption keys secured?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different standards here, I think, and to the encryption levels, and everybody is going to say you can at some point crack them, and I guess that's kind of true. But what we're really seeing is a shift here to who has access to them, because that's often how things are unencrypted, for example, or disabled. So people who have administrative rights are the things you want to protect, and there's certainly been a real shift now to using things like identity and access management, or IAM, or even more so PAM, which is privileged access management. And the notion here is that whatever needs to be protected and is encrypted, and whoever has access to the ability to decrypt it, can't be using like first dot last nomenclature here, right? They need to be doing, as I said, you're using something else. And where those tools that I mentioned, like PAM as an example, where there's a real benefit here is that it's tagged to task and it's tagged to time. So they would say, as an example, okay, I need to get access to this data, so here's what I need to do with it. Right, you have access to do that for this purpose, for this time. And when you've completed it, just like any other ticketing system, or imagine, bug fixing, right, in dev, that access is closed. So that even if somebody got your emails, or they bought them online, or they were able to spoof you or get you to surrender them, I should say, they still don't have access to those tools. As far as the encryption standards, they're going to constantly change, and they're going to constantly, this is just a cat and mouse game, right? So the bit rate to which we do this, right, or the extent that we do this, and even we've talked about quantum computing and whether or not it will work. The reality is that's going to change. I think there's a lot of standards you just need to look at based on what regulators you have to work to tell. They'll tell you what the minimum standard is that you have to use.
Okay. John, where does sensitive data enter and leave the application?
So sensitive data, once you've classified what your sensitive data is, you should have well-defined entry and exit points within the application itself. Now that could be behind some sort of authentication portal, single sign-on, your standard login, username and password. You may have API endpoints that need to have some level of authentication, a public key, or not a public key, an API key, Or what we see with a lot of cloud providers, you'll have an API key plus a secret key that needs to be defined. And I think this is one area where a lot of people, especially when they start looking at threat modeling, they tend to overlook. They understand, okay, I have my main entry point and here's my front door and everybody's going to go through the front door. The thing that a lot of people forget is attackers don't always come through the front door. To use a physical analogy, why would I sit in front of your front door and pick the lock when you've got this nice glass window right beside that I can just throw a rock through? When we start looking at applications, we take a look at these different endpoints that the data can be accessed. We always focus on that front door, but what about APIs? What about, to Mark's point, what about the other suppliers that you have in your supply chain? Again, going to SolarWinds, they didn't attack the application directly. They went after the build process. Yeah. So they went even earlier in that development lifecycle to essentially find a soft, squishy part and then start making changes there. So long before anybody even knew what was going on, they were already infecting people. So again, where's the sensitive data coming and going? That's a really good question, because there's usually lots of places, and it's much more than what you think is the quote unquote happy path, the front door, as it were, for accessing data.
Yeah, John, if I could just add to that for a second too. In the US, we don't see this in Canada through PIPEDA, but things like the California CCPA, their Privacy Act, their Consumer Privacy Act, as an example, also adds an economic element to it. So if you're sharing information with other suppliers that you need to do your job, which of course, most cases we have to, well, can they resell that information? And if they do, for how much? Or can they pull metadata from it? Even not just the actual core data itself, but who's accessing it, how often, what type of information, because if that meta information itself can also be resold. So that becomes another element if you're working in the US. And I'm sure GDPR will augment to add that economic element, because it doesn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Marty, beyond development, how can organizations secure change management and increase the client adoption of patches and updates?
So, generally with a lot of operations, especially with Windows environments, people have kind of got used to the automatic updates from using Windows or whatever. You just set that on, and then you forget about it. The unfortunate thing is, in a lot of cases within business, at the desktop level, a lot of people find that, I'm busy, I got things I have to get done. This wants to update, I can't take that time, so I'm going to cancel the updates. And that becomes an ongoing issue, because as soon as they're done, they shut off their system, go home, come back the next morning, wants to run again. They don't have time, and it keeps getting pushed off. So, updates really have to be enforced at a certain point. So you need to have some sort of auditing technology on systems to be able to say how far are they really behind in patching before I finally say you don't have a choice. We're going to force those patches through. On servers and on other systems, generally you don't want to just have automatic patches running all the time. So what you need to do is schedule, more or less change management of when you're going to bring down the systems, load them, and update them, and then bring them back, as well as have a rollback strategy so you can roll back any changes. Generally, what we're finding from a best practice level is that a lot of companies are adopting a change advisory board or a CAB board, and they run those either weekly or monthly based on the amount of changes going on in the organization. In these CAB meetings, what they do is they have the whole group. It can be the network people, the desktop people, the server people, the infrastructure, the cloud people. Everyone are pulled together, and basically any kind of changes are passed through the whole group, so everyone has transparency into what's happening, so they can see if it's going to impact their area, if there's a potential of any kind of breach or change that could happen to their area because of changes upstream or downstream. So it gives that transparency as it goes through, as well as all notes are taken and everything from a change management standpoint, so you can put those into your audit controls about what has been going on within your organization and what has been done to your systems. So we're seeing a lot around that being is more of a tool that needs to be implemented by a lot of companies, because the tendency right now is I just, I decide tomorrow I'm going to do a patching to my systems, and they do it. And then next thing you know, there's open doors left open, such as what both John and Mark were referring to as, you're giving them access as an administrator for a period of time. However, in a lot of cases, they just say, here, you got access, and they keep that administration access for, the rest of their lifetime because it hasn't been turned off and said you only have a window of X amount of hours to do that. So those are the kind of stringent plans you need to put in place as a business right now to ensure that anything you're actually doing with your systems, as well as making sure you're patching, making sure your security levels are all in place, and ensuring that your windows or the maintenance windows that you're putting out are also closing down any additional accesses you're providing to your staff.
Yes, and that CAB process that you've alluding to there is a very successful thing for our customers, so that we can protect them and support them. Just going back to the data again for a second, Mark. How is the sensitive data secured while in transit and at rest?
Typically, that's things like encryption, right? So whether it's encrypted at source, and if it's moving, it should be moving through some kind of protected tunnel, right? Like a VPN, SD-WAN, SDP, take your flavor, right? So software-defined perimeters, which is kind of a flexible VPN, or an SD-WAN, which is a virtualization of expanding your network out beyond your traditional sort of brick and mortar walls, right? And those sort of systems will create a lot of that control, but you also really have to think about where it goes. So how, example, if you're moving that data to another partner, right? So they have to do something with it. Then how's that transfer going, and making sure that that is encrypted at all stages. We have seen in some cases, where that doesn't happen, where information is emailed and it's not encrypted, right? It's not being passed through a secure source. And even things like file transfer protocol, or not FTP, but file transfer, file sharing services as well, making sure that those are encrypted and that you have restricted access, because there's kind of no point in you protecting it within your own four walls. And then, of course, when you move it to somebody else, they're not. And I've worked a couple of cases where we have seen that, where information went to be manipulated by another vendor. The vendor did not understand, and effectively it was unencrypted. Not only was it unencrypted, it was actually exposed to the internet and was then stolen. And in one case, after the fact, there was a lawsuit and a privacy investigation brought against them because it was a healthcare case. And in that circumstance, one individual sadly was doing a search for their medical condition to find out more about it, and actually found their own medical records. And that's what actually spurred the investigation.
John, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I think Mark hit the nail on the head there, right? Again, we talk about data at rest and data in transit. Again, it's encrypted at rest. Do you have an encrypted hard drive? This is a big thing, especially if people, when they're working from home, if you have employees that are essentially storing sensitive data on their laptops, one of the things you want to make sure is every single laptop has full disk encryption enabled, right? We've seen examples of people taking giant spreadsheets of social insurance numbers, having them on their laptops, and then having their laptops stolen. Even if it's just some junkie trying to steal a laptop to get some data, we don't know who the perpetrator is. So we have to treat that as it's a type of data breach, right? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Even if you think all your data is going to be stored in your servers or in the cloud, you can't necessarily guarantee, unless you have the appropriate controls in place, that someone within your organization isn't going to have some sort of local cached copy, be that a salesperson, be it a marketing person, be it a developer, be it a support person who just wants to take some work home with them and try to deal with it. Even the NSA in the US has had these issues in the past. So this is something, when we talk about threat modeling as a whole, we need to take the people aspect into account as well.
So John, what sensitive data is handled by the application?
Again, it kind of boils back to what we were talking about before in trying to determine what are the buckets of information. I think it really does depend on the type of company and the type of data that people are holding on to. What value are you bringing to your customers? And from the data that they're getting or that they're providing to you, the general rule of thumb is if someone else is giving you that data, you should treat that data with the highest level of privilege, right? It should be considered very, very important, very sensitive, and should be handled appropriately. When we start looking at some of the metadata, like what Mark was talking about before, obviously these are things that we may think, oh, this is not as good, or it's not as privileged, but sadly, sometimes it can be. If you have enough of the metadata, you can actually ascertain almost the same thing as if you had the raw data itself, right? We've seen that through various applications. I think one of the great ones that we're hearing about now is in the US with some of the cell phone data, the location data that's being sold to law enforcement, right? We don't know the types of conversations that were being had, but we know where people are, who they've been talking to, how long that conversation has been. And again, the sensitive data in that application would be the actual voice communication, right? What were people talking about? But if we know who they've been talking to, how long they've been talking to, and we have other things around there, we can definitely see how metadata can actually be very, very powerful as well.
Do you have anything to add to that, Mark? Or
Yeah, absolutely. Like John's got this right. At the end of the day, the access to data that you have and how you share it around is really going to depend what your constituency looks like, right? So if you work in healthcare or finance or manufacturing or what it might be. And I think, unfortunately, when people think about this, and I think, John, I love the way you put this around, if you get it from a customer or another vendor, you have to treat it with sort of the utmost regard and protect it. You're right, because to you, you might think it's meaningless, or you might think it's been obfuscated or anonymized in some way, but it hasn't. And you also don't know, or you should know, I should say, what the impact is to their business if it's somehow exposed. And that's why really, I mean, at this point, I don't know that there isn't data that isn't critical on some level. And the other thing I wanted to sort of touch on that John mentioned is we often think about the people at sort of, you almost think of it like a bullseye or concentric rings, right? So someone who works in the finance department, they have access to accounting information, bang on. Someone who works in the human resources department, they have PII, right? So they know the addresses and bank accounts for payroll and so on of employees, but we forget about the extension out, like sales and like marketing, who may not understand the impact of what they're doing. And nobody's doing this because they're malicious. They're doing it because they're trying to do their job, right? They're trying to achieve some positive goal for the company. They didn't understand that, oh, when I grab this data out of Salesforce or some similar tool, right? I did a data dump and I brought it home because I want to do something clever with it and do an analysis of what our funnel looks like or whatever it might be, that they are exposing the company to risk. And frankly, a lot of those kind of business services have been targeted in the last 3-4 years, right? Like going after ad agencies and so on, because maybe you don't have the core information, but you've got something that I can certainly use that's going to hurt the company. And here's a simple example. Multiple law firms in New York were targeted by cyber criminals to steal marketing information around new drugs. And this is all pre-COVID, right? And they weren't getting any detailed, gory stuff here, like patient records. They were getting press releases. Like, when was this drug? The FDA has approved this drug for pediatric use, things like that. And they used it to front run trades on those companies because they knew, oh, that stock on Monday is going to go up because the FDA passed, they passed those tests, or they failed the tests. Their stock is going to plunge on Monday, and I can short that stock. And in the end, actually, in that case, the criminals made away with about 30 million in, as the SEC said, insider trading effectively. And that's just one example. There are thousands of those kind of examples. We just don't read about them because they're not necessarily regulated. So they haven't been exposed that way.
Interesting. So maybe I'll send this over to John and Mark. We'll start with you, John. What components of a web application need to be part of a threat model and why?
So oftentimes when I think about a web application, it's a lot more than just that front-end user interface. I'll take it a little more generic, and rather than just focus on a web application, let's say applications in general. So you have the part of the application that would interface with the user. Those are absolutely things that we want to threat model. We want to look and say, okay, so what sort of inputs are we getting? What are the different entry points, exit points, that sort of thing? What encryption levels do we have? What libraries are we using? That's a big one that's often overlooked. We think about the code that we're using, but again, when we talk about supply chain, we also want to be aware of what are the downstream components that are being used as part of that application. Then we move on to other things like, hey, what about the database? All right, who has access to the database? How does that database, how is it stored? What firewalls do we have around it? What access points do we have? Who has access to it? Maybe outside of the web application, what other backdoors do we have to it? Which of our employees have access to it? Do we have to go through a VPN before we can reach that database, or is it exposed on the internet? So to distill it, essentially anything where there's any type of communication, human or machine or inter-process even, we want to make sure that we're aware of all those entry points. If there's any sort of communication between individual components, those would be areas that we would want to look at and potentially threat model.
Yeah, and how they can be threat modeled and misaligned too is, or misused or abused is important. So things like, we still see them, right? The fake updates, right? So you go to run an application in the web browser and it pops up a secondary window that says, oh, you know, you're using an out-of-date version, click here to update. Like that's unfortunately still exceptionally popular.
Yeah. So I'm going to send this out to everyone. And we'll start with you, Marty. Does the sprint affect your threat model?
Generally, if you're setting up your sprint, your development environments, you're going to have certain controls around that. So realistically, it shouldn't really impact your ability to actually do your methodology for rolling out software or impacting, you know, how you roll out your software. You just have to make sure your controls are in place to manage its way through. I think the biggest challenge we've seen, in whether it's been in sprint or in any development model or even in every day-to-day model, is that, you know, when you have developers and you have different individuals working on systems and on software and on different encryption technologies, there's a tendency to take notes, because obviously as you're building something, you're taking notes. So you're using OneNote, you're using Jira, you're using some sort of tool to collect notes. And there is a tendency for people to put, you know, encryption keys into it so that they can remember that when they're developing to go test and different things along that line. You know, we've seen even in some cases where people have put, you know, the administrator passwords in and so on, just so they can grab them quick and do their work. The unfortunate thing is that the systems they often save that into are not controlled and not managed, or don't have controls around it. So they become, if they become exposed or if they become shared, you know, they're right away you have a breach, even though you may have the best controls on your application development and so on. So you always have to look for, where's the human element in this? You know, a lot of data has been lost over the years because people have put things on USB drives and taken them with them and lost them and so on. And they can be leveraged when somebody gets it and wants to use it for you know, malicious attacks or malicious ways. So, you know, from a sprint environment, I don't see that you just need to put into your planning process around how you run your sprints and how you run your sprint development, that there always is a security element to make sure that you've locked the system down, locked your development process down before you actually run it into, you know, your testing phases.
All right, John, what something to add to that?
No, I think Marty hit a lot of really, really good points on there, especially with the fact of people, when they're doing sprint planning, they're going to have individual tickets, individual notes, and they tend to dump data in there. And I think that's one area that a lot of organizations often overlook. I remember a few years ago, there was a huge issue with Trello. So Trello is now owned by Atlassian, but people would love to put things like passwords and secret keys and whatever else into their Trello boards, except those boards were public. And no one realized how, you know, what was going on from that perspective. So, and again, you know, when we talk about threat modeling, obviously that's a separate exercise, very much like when we're going to sit down to do a development exercise, we're going to figure out what's the high level architecture, what are the individual components we want to do. Threat modeling, we're doing the same thing. We're looking at those component diagrams. We're looking at those interactions between pieces. We're building out what are the areas we have to have of concern. So when we're doing sprint planning, obviously we're going to have those individual stories as well. And to say that every sprint has to have a security element to it just makes security that much more of a hurdle, and people will want to avoid it. I think what we need to do is not look at it as a separate entity, but rather as something as a whole for the entire development process that's baked in. So as we're doing the work on a particular component or function or feature or whatever it happens to be, have we taken into account the threat model for that component? And the answer might be there isn't one, and that's okay, right? There might be something as simple as changing the color on the background screen for this particular page. I don't think anyone's going to cause any sort of harm if they change it from pink to a different fuchsia-like color, right? I don't think that's going to be a major concern. So we tend to go overboard at times when we talk about security, especially those of us who are in the field that, this is our blood and this is our passion. This is what we do. We see threats everywhere. We have to rein that back a little bit. And remember, we also don't want to upset the apple cart and make sure the business can get the work done. Because otherwise we create these artificial boundaries and barriers, which will cause people to essentially avoid them, which actually causes more harm than good down the line.
Mark?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I wanted to add there. Even sometimes innocuous information doesn't seem like it can be dangerous or weaponized, and it can be. And a quick example of that would be an Office 365 vulnerability that we found a few months ago, where effectively bad guys were popping up fake logins. The person would log in, they would actually then go to the public-facing Microsoft servers, pull down the branding, right? So they could yank down like the background, the logo, and whatever custom text you put on that login, present that, the customer logs in thinking that's what's going to happen. The creds, while harvested, also went back to Microsoft servers, so you logged in. So it looked legit, right? You got the outcome you expected. So even simple things in your development, you have to think about how might that be misused. And that's kind of back to threat modeling. But the other part of this too is think about what the communication, what that could be, what could happen to that in the hands of the wrong people. And that kind of falls in a couple of categories, right? That's not just bad guys. So if you're using, as I think John said, right, you're using, or Marty, right, you talked about using Evernote or Notes or task lists because you have to do these things. And sometimes you put confidential information in that. Flip it around to the other side. Think about what you're talking about in private might not be private. So if you're saying, man, we need to patch this because this is a massive vulnerability, or, if somebody did this and they were to abuse this, whatever it is, design, here's how that could occur. That's called discoverable, right? And if something happens down the line, I can guarantee you that the plaintiff's lawyers are going to be tearing through those logs, tearing through those email communications, looking for those kind of things. So sometimes from a development perspective, it's really great to have the smart person who goes, hey, I figured out how to threat model this. This can be used for abusive purposes. You also have to consider from a legal perspective how that's documented and how it's mitigated, because trust me, they will have that person in court and they'll be tearing them a new one on the stand to demonstrate liability or lack of reasonable care here, right? And we've also seen that kind of thing too.
All right, good. Well, we're getting close to the end of the questions. It doesn't look like we have any questions in. Maybe we'll just start wrapping up. I don't know, Marty, you want to start with any kind of closing remarks here in terms of what we've discussed today?
I think a lot of really good information came in from John and Mark, on really the overall, strategy of how you have to deal with threat management, threat modeling. Really, it comes up to every organization to really sit down and see where it sits in their overall strategic plan and ensure it's got a seat at the C level of the table to ensure that they have a process and a policy around it of how they want to deal forward. And, as both John and Mark mentioned, there is a certain amount of risk that some companies are willing to take, and there's a certain amount of risk that they can't take. And, really at the C level, they need to understand that amongst themselves and then drive that down through their organization and ensure that the proper controls, the proper models are in place, and those controls are tested regularly and the results are captured and fed back to them so that they can ensure that they're doing everything within their power to make sure the data is secure. Obviously there's a lot of people out there with a lot of time to try to hack into systems and to misuse systems. And let's face it, there's a lot of smart people. So they do know how to make, things happen. From our perspective, we have to do more work to make sure that we try to close every door we possibly can, and then ensure that if there is a door that sneaks open and they sneak in, we close it even faster and make sure it doesn't happen again. And that really is where the onus of the organization comes in.
Mark?
Yeah, I heard my favorite word there, which is risk. So when it comes to security, security is not an IT problem to solve. It's a business risk to manage. So you really do have to understand what that looks like from different things like the technology you're using, how you develop your stack and your products and services, the industry segments that you play in, et cetera. Because actually the thing that keeps me up at night, and I work with a lot of different industries like legal and healthcare and manufacturing and finance and so on, is that some mid-sized vendor, right? Not the Microsofts and the Amazons and these guys, but the mid-sized one who has a specialty and a market dominance in that particular industry, that they are exposed. So take Kaseya and now not generically apply it across all sorts of different business types and business sectors, but now apply it to just healthcare or to just legal or just manufacturing. You shut down 300 or 400 of these institutions simultaneously and you demand whatever ransoms. At the end of the day, you're going to cause a lot of chaos. That's when governments are going to have to react. And that's when you're going to see a lot of regulatory kind of discipline come into play, where they'll suddenly say, you know what, you guys aren't capable of managing the kindergarten. Unfortunately, we're going to come, have to be the adults in the room. And, as that vendor, I worry for them. And this is why it's so imperative that they defend and protect themselves, because you imagine what that's going to be like if you're the one at the heart of that event. That probably is going to make your ability to continue business extremely difficult in that industry segment.
And John?
Yeah, I just, echoing everything that Marty and Mark are talking about, to start off with, if you want to have any level of success, be it in threat modeling, be it in security, be it in privacy, be it in whatever, you need to really have that guidance coming from the C-level down. If we don't have that executive leadership, if we don't have that executive buy-in, no one else is going to take it seriously. And, to put it into perspective, we're not talking about doing things for the sake of doing them because we're the experts that are telling you, hey, security is important. Obviously, that's in our best interest to say. But let's face facts. When it comes to your individual organizations, taking any type of a breach means harm to your reputation, your name in the industry. It's going to come down to the bottom line. You are going to lose revenue, be that because customers are fleeing or be that because you're having some sort of regulatory fine that's coming in. Again, that could be from GDPR, that could be from CCPA, that could be from HIPAA, that could be from PCI. Imagine being cut off from being able to process credit card transactions because you didn't handle credit card data properly. How badly would that cripple your business? I mean, if you're in the hospitality business, you're dead in the water, right? You're essentially going to be shut down. So, I mean, from all these perspectives, it's important to understand as a whole, threat modeling it's not an expensive exercise. This is not a difficult thing to do. Spend some time with someone who knows what's going on. They can actually train you, right? Our philosophy at EliteSec is very simple. We want to teach you how to fish so that you can take care of yourselves moving forward, because ultimately this is something we want to have ingrained. And I think all of us here agree this is something that's important for organizations as a whole to be successful in order to maintain the longevity of that organization in the long run.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, you guys have given us a lot of great information. I see there's a ginormous advertisement for No Safe Harbor behind your screen there, Mark, which I have your book, by the way.
Thank you very much. Supplied by the publisher. Yes, it's the requirement.
And I'd just like to add, Foxnet is very proud and happy to be a partner of eCentire and delivering the eCentire security services along with our other services for IT. It's really given us a sense of safety when we're out there talking to our thousands of customers that are using our services. So our partnership here and the fact that you're a local company has been very successful for us. So thanks for your participation today, and you too, John. So Marty,
you're very welcome.
I guess I'll hand this over to Brandy. I think we're almost at the end of the show. So
yeah, great. Thank you everyone for joining us, John, Mark, and Marty for participating in the panel, and of course, Bill for moderating. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll be sending some follow-up communications, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks again.